Chapter 12. During this period of my life, between the ages of 24, when I started on what I imagined to be my career, and 30, by which time I had abandoned this folly, my mother complained that my wanderings filled a whole address book, and her address books were not small. I did not have a restless temperament, but I selected my lodgings on a fallacious principle. In my secret heart, or to avoid exaggeration, my secret space, I still thought of myself as living for others. My choice of a room was never dictated by taste or convenience. I gravitated only toward the greatest opportunity for putting myself at the mercy of other people, and moved into a succession of places let to me by friends, and in some instances by mere acquaintances, who wished to lighten the burden of their rent, but had no accommodation that they would have dared to offer a stranger. When the discomfort, and sometimes the downright degradation, became too much for me, I moved on to fresh pits and pendulums new. If I mention that I addressed even my closest friends as Mr. This and Mrs. That, it may be easy to guess how hard it would have been for me to reach any degree of intimacy with my own personality. I never called the various components of my character by their first names, although it had been such a relief to live on my own in Denby Street. I changed my address 11 times before I finally gave up trying to disguise from myself my deep-seated indifference to the fate of others, settled into a room by myself, and admitted that solitude was one of my essential needs. The fact that I wanted to be alone did not mean that I disliked people. I liked my friends, and I adored strangers. I have been accused of flirting with everybody, but my intention was not to arouse sexuality. It was merely to entertain. Even a minimal remark about the rain provoked me to say, "The weather's been nationalized." If invited to the house of a friend, I was cozy, but should I find there people I had not met before, I plunged into a complete cabaret turn. I did not know that a reputation for wit is earned not by making jokes, but by laughing at the pleasantries of others. It was this mistaken idea that to win people I must dazzle them that made it essential for me to live alone. From time to time I had to stagger into my dressing room. I left my 6 shillings attic in Clerkenwell to share a room in Maida Vale with a disused actor. He slept in the only bed, and I stayed awake, bent like a jackknife on the sofa. After a while he started to bring strange men back with him in the middle of the night. In the morning I frequently discovered that these were people who only a few nights previously had been trying to ravish me with one hand and rip off my wristwatch with the other in Edgware Road. I was as embarrassed as Cardinal Wolsey at finding myself naked in the presence of my enemies. Also, I had found my own sex life unpleasant enough. I had no intention of becoming a witness to anyone else's. I moved on to Linhope Street, where my stay was marked by only one incident. It was here that I was first visited by the police. My Irish friend had disappeared some time back, but the Scotsman and the girl, who had finally come out in his favor, still kept in touch with me. My chief function in their lives was, when either of them was in jail, to keep them in touch with each other without the prison governor being apprised of any address but mine. This was how the police managed to establish a connection between them and me, and, probably when the young man failed to report to his probation officer, they called on me to ask for his address. I did not give it to them. I held the opinion that however low a man sinks, he never reaches the level of the police. I and many of the thieves, prostitutes, and other social outcasts who were my friends resorted to some very dodgy expedients in order to stay alive, but only the police habitually groveled for their wages in the excrement of the world. The rest of us, however clumsily, however over hastily, reached out toward life and love. Only the police trafficked exclusively in darkness and death. "If you go on like this," my visitor warned me, "you will be charged with harboring undesirables." I pointed out that if my Scottish friend had been undesirable, I might not have bothered. The interview came to an abrupt end. Shortly after this, I moved again. At one moment, I was sharing 2 rooms with the art student, and at another, I was the lodger of Mrs. Check. Tired of taking off her clothes for so many for so little, she had become a nightclub hostess, and required a lodger to help pay the expense of a W1 address. This had to be someone who would not complain of the disturbance caused by her occasionally heaving semi-conscious men up the stairs in the middle of the night. For a life of this kind, she was totally unsuited. She was not merely shy, but innately respectable. It was therefore not long before she required yet another lodger. There were so few wolves at the door. I recommended that we should offer the last available room to the daughter of a clergyman whom my sister knew. This girl stole whatever money was left in the house, and finally revealed to Mrs. Check the secret that I had managed to keep for so long, that Mr. Check was living in open sin with the art student on Tower Hill. When questioned as to why she had done this, the clergyman's daughter said she was Mrs. Check's friend. Against all odds, the story had a happy ending. Mrs. Check divorced her gramophone-pawning husband and married an habitué of the establishment where she worked. When they went to live in splendor outside London, my mother and I visited them, and my lifelong admiration for men of action was increased 100-fold. During our stay, I became aware of the terrible price they have to pay in their declining years. The new husband had been a born leader of men in some outpost of our not yet fallen empire. In retirement, he found himself without inner resources of any kind. All the morning he wandered from room to room, murmuring, "When will we be having lunch, my love?" And throughout the afternoon he asked if it was tea-time. He did not partake of either meal, preferring to sit at the table sipping whiskey while we ate. His inquiries were made only because he longed for some assurance that, though all else was now inert, time was still moving. I had attended Mrs. Check's divorce breakfast, but at her second wedding, which took place after a dignified interval, I was not present. I felt that this would not have befitted my station in life. By that time I had moved to Chelsea. Here, in a mixed-with-water way, I lived the bed-sitting room existence, whose oddities Rodney Ackland seemed to flaunt before the amazed eyes of matinee audiences. I entered a boarding-house as a foundation member almost before the paint on the back cloth was dry. It was run by actors, and soon filled up with stock characters: an actress, tempestuous; a fashion artist, brittle; an American girl in search of experience, bewildered. And we all ran in and out of each other's rooms, making tea and talking about our futures. After a while this mixture was enriched by a touch of social realism. A colored gentleman was added. The announcement of his arrival was made with a flourish to the inner circle as we sat in the basement awaiting our scrambled egg supper. Landlord: "I want you all to know that there is a coal-black Negro living at the top of the house." Lodger: "Oh dear, and there's no lock on my door." Landlord: "In that case, Mrs. Thomas, you will have to think of some other method of preventing his escape." This was the first house I had ever lived in, including those of my childhood, which seemed to be home. As far as possible, the outer world was excluded. Any real people who did succeed in crawling past the screening devices merely murmured to themselves if they met me in the hall, "That illusion again," and went upstairs to take 2 aspirins. All the same, I could not have said that I was part of a Chelsea life. I knew only one bearded artist and only one model. I never went to a bohemian party, and I never got drunk. For about 20 years, I lived in a state of intoxication with my own existence, and, perhaps for that very reason, excess of alcohol was one of the extremes to which I felt no urge to fly. I asked many people why they drank so much, but never received an explanation that I fully understood. It was the tales of their escapades, while under the influence of drink, that brought me nearest to comprehending their need for it. It seemed to give them a few hours of freedom from rules which, during the rest of their lives, they reluctantly obeyed. If this was true, then in the example of my life lay a cure for drunkenness, though it was hardly an answer which Harley Street would have approved. The prophylactic is never to conform at all. It was while I lived in Chelsea that I became a freelance artist. Most of my nights were spent not in sinning, but in executing the work that it had taken me all day to wrest from the astonished fingers of manufacturers and publishers. When not busy in this way, if I went out at all, it was to visit friends. One of these was Mr. Cross, whose life was a recipe for success. Never before, and seldom since, had I witnessed such indefatigability and such singleness of purpose. He wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. "I want," he exclaimed, in an accent that you could have cut with a sword, "to have behind me a great body of work." He was 22 at the time. Even had I known that all this apparently fruitless effort would one day lead to his ruling the worlds of radio and television, I could not have followed his example. Industry of that intensity is composed only in part of energy. This I possessed. The rest is optimism, which I lacked. Before my life became one long holiday, I was given a last vacation with pay. A few days of this I decided to spend in Portsmouth, which was, in those days, the Mecca of the homosexual world. I could not do anything so brazen as openly to set out for the South Coast in a spirit of hilarious research. Because the venture was motivated by sexual curiosity, I had to arrange to be edged into it by quite innocent forces. I leaned forward so that fate could see me, and waited. Soon an acceptable pretext fell into my lap. The parson's daughter, who had nearly wrecked my Czech friend's life, was a student of drama in so many ways, and through her I had already met a lot more embryonic actresses. They were kind enough to provide me with countless free seats for cultural plays, from which I learned, if nothing else, that culture was not for me. Some years before I had given up reading. Now I was ready to give up theater-going, unless it was free. I started to shed the monstrous aesthetic affection of my youth, so as to make room for the monstrous Philistine postures of middle age, but it was still some years before I was bold enough to decline an invitation to Hamlet, on the grounds that I already knew who won. Long after I had ceased to befriend the parson's daughter, I continued to see another drama student with whom she had once shared a room. This girl wanted to take a band of strolling, even meandering, players to the Isle of Wight to play Shakespeare's works in the open air. This scheme entered her head, presumably because nature abhors a vacuum, and also because every summer her mother ran a boarding-house in Shanklin, where she may have hoped her troupe could obtain food and lodging when all else failed. I was told about this project because my help was needed. The proposition was that I should lend her £10, and she would arrange for me to stay for a week free of charge in her mother's house. I acquiesced in this on the grounds that the most anyone would expect from a holiday was a change of agony. It also enabled, nay compelled, me to pass through Portsmouth. Chapter 13. Like Florrie Ford, I, and most of the homosexuals whom I knew best, wanted something in a uniform. Any national dress or occupational outfit may be sexually stimulating, and there are as many kinks as there are kinds of costume. Uniforms appeal to devotees of the fearless man of action. They also pander to the Kofetika complex so prevalent among homosexuals. When any of my friends mentioned that he had met a divine sailor, he never meant an officer. Women seemed to feel differently about these things. They prefer airmen, by which they always mean the higher ranks. I used to sit in the window seat in a King's Road cafe, discussing these matters with a certain Mrs. Gardner. Not long afterward, she met Neville Heath. I should have guessed that she was a born murderee. She used to wear a leopardette coat. When I was young, the word soldier meant one of the red-coated guardsmen who strutted up and down Knightsbridge in the evenings. These men were willing to go for a walk in the park for as little as half a crown. This appeared to be what Berwick Street would call a desperate bargain at a never-again price. But had I accepted the offer, I have no doubt that I should have been beaten to a pulp, with or without benefit of sex. Sailors never asked for money, but on the contrary had large sums of money to spend in short spasms of shore leave. They also never turned nasty. Perhaps the act of running away to sea was an abandonment of accepted convention, and after a sojourn in strange ports, they returned with their outlook and possibly their anus broadened. The fabulous generosity in their natures was an irresistible lure, especially when combined with the tightness of their uniforms, whose crowning aphrodisiac feature was the fly flap of their trousers. More than one of my friends has swayed about in ecstasy describing the pleasures of undoing this quaint sartorial device. All that is ended now. Naval uniforms have been altered. With a vertical instead of horizontal opening to their trousers, sailors can walk their shoes to the uppers without a single stranger asking them for a light. They can linger even in Piccadilly without ever being offered a pint of beer. I was already long past the age when I knew or hoped to know any members of any of the forces before this happened, so I cannot say whether it was with a groan that the sea gave up its trousers. Among my friends there was certainly a day of mourning, as someone remarked when told the new atom bombs would explode without a bang. They can't leave anything alone. Today a visit to Portsmouth would not be worth the train fare, but in the summer of 1937 the whole town was like a vast carnival with, as its main attraction, a continuous performance of HMS Pinafore. As most of the men were in uniform, and the girls wore shorts and bras in the street, it seemed that everyone was in fancy dress. This much I saw from the taxi window, while I was being driven toward the hotel which the driver had chosen. "It'll be the best for you," he said. He may simply have meant that it was one where I stood a good chance of being let in. Having been refused admittance to many restaurants, and even a few cinemas, I had wondered whether I would meet with any trouble of this kind, but none occurred. With a poker face, I thanked the young man, who carried my luggage upstairs, for both pieces of information when he explained where the gentlemen's, and a moment later, where the ladies' lavatories were. When I had unpacked it was about 6 o'clock in the evening. I decided to lie down for about half an hour to rally my forces. I overdid the relaxing rituals and fell asleep. I got up the instant that I awoke, but by the time I had clapped on as much makeup as the forces of gravity would allow, it was night. Outside the hotel, I paused for a second, not knowing which way to go. A second was long enough. I was instantly surrounded by sailors. I explained that I wished to walk along the seafront, and they offered to show me the way. From then on, our progress was like a production number in a Hollywood musical. The chorus was continually on the increase, as my guides called out to their friends, who, even if they had been going in the opposite direction, turned back to join us. When we arrived at the seafront, as many of us as could sat on one of the seats, while others perched on the railings. The beach was strewn with lovers, and even a few couples sleeping with their children and their luggage beside them. The distinction between indoors and outdoors, which in England is usually so marked, was temporarily suspended in a hot, gauzy trance. The sailors told me how to recognize the North Star, and explained various quaint items of nautical lore. I expressed suitable amazement, addressing my remarks to the sea. I quickly found that if I spoke directly to any one of my companions, he blushed, and the others hit him till he fell off the seat. There was a great deal of laughing and flopping about, but the conversation never fell below the level of the risque. There were no threats, no insults, and very little personal interrogation. The only question I remember being asked was one that has always cropped up in those days. "Do you know Fred Barnes?" A few years later, this became, "Did you ever meet Fred Barnes?" for he had committed suicide. After a while, when it became obvious that there was going to be speech but no action, without becoming angry, the sailors began two by two to drift away, until I was left with two castaways. Older men, who had once been in the Navy, or possibly merely wished they had. They walked back with me to the hotel, which turned out to be shut. I was surprised, having imagined in my Monte Carlo dream that all seaside hotels were open all night. To my companions this was one last huge joke. They took me to a place where we would be able to sit around until daybreak. This, too, was shut. My escorts banged on the doors until, with a rattling of chains and a creaking of hinges as though we were about to enter a dungeon, we were admitted to a huge canteen full of down-and-outs. The proprietor had hair so red that the pigmentation had flowed out into every visible inch of his skin, and even into the pinks of his eyes, as the color of flowering cherry trees stains their leaves. The place we entered was just like the dining hall at school, except that there was a large tea urn on a counter that ran along one end of the room. We ate as much as we could, to make it worth the redskins' while to have undone all those bolts. Then we settled down to innumerable cups of tea. Our chatter and our laughter awoke other inmates. They lifted their heads out of their plates and crossed the room to join us in yet more rounds of teas. When I judged that it must be daylight in the streets, I crept back to my hotel. I had been speaking, off and on, but chiefly on, for about 8 hours. I slept until the following evening. I never saw Portsmouth by day. When, the morning after that, I sat in the early train back to London, I tried to recall what adventure, what romance I had expected this visit to offer me. But, as though I had seen the movie after reading the book, reality had now obscured the dream. I had beheld a miracle. That was the first, last and only time that I ever sat in a crowd of people whose attention I really desired, without once feeling that I was in danger. For this reason, all the quality of that evening, and all the evenings like it that never came, remained with me for many years, until I no longer felt the need for this kind of relationship with this kind of person, until my desires had changed, and my whole nature had coarsened in a way that on that night in Portsmouth I would have thought impossible. Chapter 14. At that period of my life, the average length of my tenancy of any one room was about 4 months, so I would have described myself as having lived in Chelsea for a long time. I was there just over a year. Toward the end of my stay, it transpired that I had only imagined that I was among friends. When I had already given notice, I was accused by one of my landlords of stealing money from the room of another tenant. After a day or two, the lost purse was found, but no apology was offered. I was then accused of having put it back. Of the two indictments, the latter was by far the more annoying. I have never had much respect for the law, including the law of property, though until St. Gennet set his famous example, I had never thought of boasting about this. But I was very indignant that my enemies should suddenly pretend to think me likely to give way to remorse. They had constantly exclaimed that I was ruthless. This last epithet, although it was intended as an insult, I had always covertly regarded as praise. Gestures of atonement sickened me. Unless it was by accident that I caused harm to somebody, I never apologized. Pardon, sought or granted, was to me a fatuous social flourish. It was a further infliction of cruelty on a victim, forcing upon him who already had some ill to bear the humiliating chore of uttering a few words of feigned forgiveness. I no longer inhaled a permanent atmosphere of disapproval, but suspicion, once aroused, automatically fell on me. I do not think that, to this day, things have changed much in this respect, although it was only when I was already leaving that people's true feelings emerged in the same way that, in the street, the whistles and the catcalls began not when I was approaching, but when I had already passed by. I took up residence in a mews in Belgravia as the lodger of a teacher of ballet. She had rented a huge barn of a place, with a view to sleeping in it by night and giving lessons there by day. Living in this mews placed us at the bottom of a deep ravine formed by the 5-story houses of the rich. From the top back windows of these mansions, the last members of the dying race of domestic servants looked down, but not in mercy. When I first moved into my room, I had no curtains, and later, when these were provided, I seldom drew them. This was a difficult operation, necessitating a climb onto my desk, since even the bottoms of the windows were above my head. What could be seen of my room was the bed. On this there was usually somebody lying. Since there was only one chair in the room, an upright wooden one that I used when sitting at my drawing-board, there was nowhere else for my friends to relax. I soon received my second visit from the police. This time there were 2 of them, a detective inspector and a young man with no speaking part, who merely stood by the door as though he half expected he'd have to prevent me rushing hatless into the street. The inspector claimed that he had called because of complaints lodged by the neighbors that they could see into my room. What they saw they didn't like. It is said that when Mae West was told that Americans complained of the suggestiveness of her radio program, she drawled, "They could have turned it off." My sentiments were the same, but my aplomb was not. With downcast eyes and scarlet cheeks, I promised that in future I would be careful what I did. This seemed to be an insufficient answer, for the policeman then shouted, "Things go on in this house for which the penalty is 7 years' imprisonment." This was the first time that the laws regarding private indecency had ever been brandished before me. I remained calm, and a few minutes later he left. As he did so, he told me his name twice, as though, if I ever decided to give myself up, he expected me to send for him. As soon as my visitors had left, I telephoned all those friends who might not wish to call at an establishment that was being watched by the police. I started with a man fairly highly placed in one of the ministries, with whom, after many years of happy celibacy, I was having a dismal affair. His terror of disgrace was such that he never visited me in daylight. He was careful to telephone a few minutes before his arrival to make sure that no one, not even the ballet teacher, was on the premises. All liaisons between homosexuals are conducted as though they were between a chorus girl and a bishop. In some cases, both parties think they are the bishops. I realized I was a chorus girl and quite happily knew men for as long as 17 years without knowing their surnames or their addresses. Anyone who allowed himself to become my friend was doing me a favor. I always tried to make it clear that I was aware of at least some of the penalties that went with knowing me. Before a relationship had gone very far, I usually explained that, in difficult circumstances, I did not expect to be acknowledged. I only ever knew one woman who did not treat this remark as an attempt to put the loyalty of my friends to the utmost test. One day, as I was walking wickedly up Rathbone Place, I saw her coming innocently down, accompanied by an anti-hooligan, whom I guessed to be a client of the firm for which she worked. Talking airily of in millions, as she passed within a foot of me, without either of us glancing in the direction of each other. Neither of us mentioned the incident subsequently, but from that moment onward, with that woman, I felt absolutely free. There were others, however, whose very fear seemed to urge them to defy the world. Once I was invited to the house of a movie writer with the words, "Mrs. Smith will be here with her 2 children. She comes from Pinner. I can't imagine what she'll make of you, but still." When I remarked that it would surely be better if I came on a different day, my suggestion was swept aside, as though I was being morbidly sensitive. At the great confrontation, as I stretched out to this woman a hand weighed down with coral and turquoise, my host said to her, "You can touch him. He's quite real." Until that moment she had been doing all right. She had doubtless thought, "I'll ask my husband about this when I get home," and then made her mind a complete blank. As soon as the remark about me was uttered, she was visibly stricken with embarrassment. So was I. At one time, Crisp's first law would have stated that those who most fear disgrace invariably behave outlandishly. Now I see that I mistook the cause for the effect. It is those who, for some unknown reason, have no idea how they will behave in a social emergency, who quite naturally dread the world's censure. On this principle, the man from the ministry continued to visit me, and on one occasion, when I was clambering about on the furniture, said that he couldn't think why I bothered to draw the curtains. I took no notice of this foolhardiness. As it happened, the threats of the police never came to anything. I was not arrested for many years, and when I was, the circumstances were different. While I lived in Belgravia, 2 new ways of supplementing my fitful income from commercial art presented themselves. The first of these was writing, at which, so far, I had never had the least success. The Blandford Press, for whom I had often designed a book jacket or laid out an advertisement in one of their magazines, suggested that I should write a book about window dressing. I had never thought of doing this before, because I knew nothing about the subject. The publishers did not think that this was any handicap, so I flung myself upon the project with all my half-starved weight, and quickly wrote 30,000 words. I had only one idea to put forward, that in any visual field, maximum interest lies at the point of maximum contrast. After several shaky years, the book sold its edition. This only proves once more that people will pay to read what they already know. I made £60, but though I have written 1 book and a few articles since, I cannot say that my hope that writing might become a second career was ever fulfilled. The other profession, in at the door of which I desperately thrust my lacquered toe, was tap dancing. My landlady did not want pupils who wished to learn other forms of dancing than ballet to be turned away for lack of a fully equipped staff of experts. This was another subject of which I was totally ignorant, though this weakness never came to light. Only one student with tap dancing in mind ever turned up, and she was a beginner. I taught her by keeping 1 tap ahead at each lesson. The occupants of the workshop below had to endure a noise overhead like an African hailstorm beating on a tin roof, while I hastily practiced what I had just been taught before my pupil arrived to learn it. The steps were not made any easier for either of us by the clearly audible curses from below. To those poor workmen, peace only came with the outbreak of war. When war was declared, I went out and bought 2 pounds of henna.